to Voices of the Archive, Part 2. I think we're ready to go here. It's been a bit of a chaotic morning, and one advantage of that for me is I didn't get to obsessively go over my notes until I was a nervous wreck. So I may not be able to read them, but at least I won't be panting and carrying on. Thank you for coming. And Pa heard that Florence was booming. Since he was a carpenter, it seemed like a good place to find work. In 1900, he moved us by wagon train from Oklahoma to Florence. I was 5 years old, but I remember that long ride. When we arrived, Florence was full of smallpox. One of Pa's first jobs was to build a pest house. Meanwhile, we were quarantined across the river on Cyanide Avenue near Well 42. Pa helped construct many buildings in Florence. I married Russell Burroughs in Florence on May 21st, 1921, and on that day, I moved into his farmhouse near Wetmore, where I still live. Russell was killed in an accident on the farm in 1934, and I was left with 2 young children. My father was Alfred N. Strickland, and my brother John still lives in Florence. Mrs. Hattie Strickland Burroughs, 1971, from the Burroughs Ranch in Wetmore. Rockville was desolate and smoky and quite a shock to a young girl used to the fertile land of northern Italy. Papa had come 2 years earlier and left us in Italy. I spent my many homesick days after arriving in May of 1900. Mother was happy just to be back with Papa, but it was difficult for me to adjust to the ways of the country and the language. The trip was 11 days by boat and then 4 days by train to reach Pueblo. Mary Valenzano, Florence, Colorado, 1971. Yep, missing a page. Okay, so right here, we're supposed to have a page that's about, yes, please. A page that is a newspaper, an old newspaper article. Water notice. As you all know, water restrictions are on. Please disconnect your hose and put it away so no one can accuse you of using the water. This past week, the mayor had hauled a tank of water from the river to water his lawn and flowers. Being in a hurry, they did not watch it and it ran out onto the road. Of course, it was seen and reported as some assumed he was using town water. Seems since that several people have said if the mayor can do it, so can we. Please do not take that attitude. If we all did and went ahead and watered without finding out first what went on, it would only be a short time before the water was gone. This is dangerous in more ways than one. It is a health hazard as well as a hazard should there be fires. So please cooperate and do not water no matter how you feel. It is with this, so that was reported in the Florence Citizen in 1956, September, by Alice Maglietto, the reporter from Rockville. My things are all mixed up here. And so I'm about to go into explaining to you that Voices of the Archives is the focus research project of 2021 of the Florence Historical Archive. Every year, the Board of Directors of the Archives chooses a topic of significance to our local history and the members conduct research on aspects of that topic. Normally, we present a 2-hour class based on that research at the mini college held every year at the Pueblo Community College in Canyon City. That was until the pandemic. We hope to be back there again in 2022. In addition, for the last 3 years, we have presented a series of programs created from that research project here at the Bell Tower, and we are available to present brief programs based on our research to local groups and organizations. This year, we are back at the Bell Tower every second Sunday through November. We have a guide on the table back in the back, this one, that tells you about the other programs coming up, 3 more after this one, and please take one home if you would like to. Today, with this year's topic, Voices of the Archive, our goal was to bring new material to light of the experiences of earliest people of Florence. We wanted to unearth some of the hidden gems of information from the archives file in the form of letters, diaries, newspapers, books, and photos, and as often as possible from the actual voices of early settlers through family stories and memories via interview with the descendants of these people. And next month there'll be an interesting one coming up where one of our researchers has been working with a distant cousin of hers, John Lobeck. And that's Margaret, by the way. In addition, we are interested in understanding how the village was formed. That is, stories of events that led to development of social history patterns of settlements, culture, and ethnic influences, water resources, neighborhood and subdivision development, and more. Today, Dayon Boughton and Dorothy Kuhl will introduce us to Jessie Frazier, one of the area's most innovative pioneers and a significant contributor to the growth of the area, both as a civic leader and as a farmer. Dayon will start with some of Jessie Frazier's civic contributions.
Welcome to the archives. What are archives? He's telling me to talk in the microphone. This better? Is this okay? All right, what are archives? Clippings, letters, pictures, the past you don't care about until you suddenly feel the need to find out about something that happened a long time ago, or perhaps just yesterday. Then archives become important. It's surprising what you may run across while looking for something else. I got a surprise. It was suggested that I research Jessie Frazier. Don't confuse F-R-A-Z-E-R with F-R-A-S-E-R or F-R-A-S-I-E-R. Similar names, but different people. Jessie was born in 1819 in Missouri to James F. Frazier and Polly Crow. In 1855, while visiting his brother in Denver, Jessie met and married Mrs. Elizabeth Turner Ashe. Elizabeth was a single mother raising her very young son, William. Her husband had been killed in the Fort Pueblo massacre during the California Gold Rush. In 1859, when the Fraziers came west, Jessie was a remarkable pioneer, and Elizabeth the first white woman in Fremont County. Before Florence was Florence, he helped plan the new town. They settled in the western part of what is now near the Florence Elementary School. An early comer to Florence, Jessie Frazier brought with him a love of growing things, plus knowing that if the place he lived was to become a neighborhood, it had to feed people as well as keep them warm and nourish their souls. Jessie acquired hundreds of acres stretching from Florence to Coal Creek. He noticed an outcropping of coal. That became the Coal Creek Mine, one of Fremont County's most productive. Coal requires a market, and Canyon City was the nearest, with delivery to blacksmiths by ox cart. It's simple, but a much larger market was emerging. Frazier's low sulfur bituminous coal was hard and burned clean. It was in demand. As more coal was produced, moving it to a larger market required industrial intervention. Inching their way across the nation, railroads were pulled by engines that burned coal. Jesse's market grew. In 1871, Frazier sold his claim to J.T. Musser, who was selling coal to Colorado Coal and Iron Company, CC&I, which later became Colorado Fuel and Iron, CF&I. In 1860, breaking ground with a plow he made from a cottonwood branch and pulled by oxen, Frazier became a horticulturist. He planted 2,000 apple trees as well as berries. He brought the seedlings home from Missouri along the Arkansas River. Orchards are hard work with a critical need for water. Irrigation became another Frazier achievement. Imagine, if you will, a spring in Florence with 2,000 apple trees in bloom. He developed the Colorado orange apple, which took first place awards at many events in the late 1800s. A devout Methodist, he deeded land and built a log Methodist Episcopal church. Years later, he built another church on the southwest corner of 2nd and Petroleum, right across the way. Referred to as uncle by many in Florence, Jesse Frazier was a highly respected man. His original home site is now Camarillo Dairy. Jesse and Elizabeth are buried in Florence Highland Cemetery. Her son, William Ashe, a very well thought of commissioner in Custer County, is buried in Little Lake Cemetery. Why do I care about Jesse Frazier? I'm not related to him, but my kids are. Jesse was my mother-in-law's great uncle. Jesse was my husband Lynn's great uncle. May I introduce some of the Jesse Frazier's great relatives sitting in the hall today? Jared Belton and Mike Fry. Jerry and Mike were the first wedding in the new church in 1976. The vows were administered by Dr. Steinmetz from the Methodist Church and Father Alquin from St. Benedict's. And we have David Belton and Eileen. And David is Lindy Sprinkler, and Eileen is retired from Pueblo Horticultural. And now we also have, I see, Orion and Kenna Belton. That's great nephew. And then we have great nieces, Mackenzie and Briar. So there you are, facts. Until a few days ago, I didn't know. It's a small world after all.
Hello, everybody. I am from a long line of storytellers. Go to the next one. You see this picture? It was taken in 1912. It is the only picture of my dad and his brother. My dad is the dark one in the back, and the only picture of my grandpa. And go to the next one. And here they are in old age. And you can tell they have got to have been storytellers. They could tell real whoppers. And they did. And my brother tells me that he would go to bed at night and My uncles and dad would be out on the porch, and he would get up in the morning, and they would still be out on the porch telling stories. And that was the days just before TV, so you had to come up with some real whoppers. And then I was visiting with my cousin on the telephone recently, and he said to me, you know, I've got the abstract to the farm that I am living on. And I'm like, wow, that's wonderful. Whose farm is it? And he said, Jesse Frazier's farm. And so you see there's connections all the way down the line. And I see that he has chickened out. I was going to make him come because he showed me the abstract. I know it's available. I know it's in his house somewhere. But he's probably ashamed that, because I was going to build my entire talk around the abstract that is a history. Today we get deeds. Back in the old days you got abstracts, and they would take you all the way back in history, telling who it was sold to and how long and where and all that kind of stuff. So I had to come up with my own way of giving the talk, but here we go. Okay, Jesse Frazier, I know that Dion told you a lot about Jesse. He was a pioneer grandson of a man who accompanied Daniel Boone on his migration and adventures in Missouri from their home in Kentucky. And Jesse was born in 1819 in Missouri, and then he moved with his parents at 8 years of age to Illinois. Education was in short supply. He was part of a group of people who stayed one step ahead of civilization. As progress came closer to them, they would pull up stakes and move on, further on. This saying is probably one of theirs. Well, I'm off at last, but who can say when or where I will stop? We are finally up and off for the West, the far West. Where is that? I had always believed I had been born in the West, but no, here we go in search of it. Further on, further on. When he was at 40 years of age, he joined the gold rush to Cherry Creek, Colorado. That was in 1859. His brother was already there. After watching his brother and observing the hard life of lead miners, where he had ran a store for 2 years in Missouri, he quickly decided that mining was not for him. He did know that they all needed food. Having farmed the majority of his life, he decided to stick with it, with what he knew. He and his brand new wife and her son, William Ash, all headed south. You see, this is a picture of Canyon City. They arrived in Canyon City 3 years before this was even a county. Canyon City was in its infancy. This picture right here is taken down on 2nd Street. There were several businesses that supplied the gold miners in Cripple Creek. Main Street was coming to life. The streets were built to accommodate teams of 4 horses or 4 oxen. You do realize when it is a team, 4 means 8. There's a team of 2. They delivered supplies to the miners. It was 12 more years before the territorial prison was built. The streets of Canyon City are so wide, and they have been chiseling them down steadily ever since. But that was why they were built so wide, so they could turn a team of 4 oxen, 4 horses. Anyway, Jesse continued his journey, ending up 8 miles south and east of Canyon City in an area that is now known as Florence, right here. He chose a property right alongside the Arkansas River where irrigation water was more available. The property is where my no-show cousin lives today. If you will look carefully at this picture, it is an old picture of Castle Rock. Jesse squatted on land just east of a hill known as Castle Rock and just south of the river in Indian Territory. Not only Indian Territory, but on ground that was full of bears. Oh, the bear hunting stories he could tell. And by the way, the top of this mountain was where the Indians would light signal fires to warn their compatriots of danger ahead. He and his wife Elizabeth was left alone. His wife Elizabeth was left alone for weeks at a time, but Frazier had established friendly relations with the Indians, the Ute Indians especially. Chief Uray actually borrowed Jesse's guns from him during a fight with the Arapahoes. He returned them when the fight was over. Life was hard in those early days. Going to the store alone took 2 weeks. A week to Denver and a week back. Canyon City had few supplies in those days. Once Jesse forded the river and walked to Canyon City for a sack of flour, which cost him $18, and he carried it back on his back when he returned home, crossing the river again with a big 100-pound sack of flour on his back. Canyon City had few supplies. In fact, during the Civil War, during 1861 to 1865, it became the Rip Van Winkle town of the West. All of the residents left, returning to their previous lives and obligations concerning the Civil War. There was an oppressive silence along those empty streets. Their first winter, he had seen an outcropping of coal that was free for the taking. He filed on the land a claim in his name. He would load the wagon and sell the coal clear to Denver. A story was told about the time he was taking a load of coal to the blacksmith Anson Rudd in Canyon City. The river was very high at the time, and the team of horses lost their footing, dumping him into the boiling water, nearly drowning him. He later sold the mining claim to a man named Musser, who was the man responsible for developing the mining in Coal Creek. Okay. During his first winter, he fashioned a plow from a cottonwood limb. That first spring, he was the first to turn a furrow on a farm in the whole area. That summer, he sold his vegetables and Mexican corn for a huge profit to the starving miners. Soon his whole area was filling up with Fraziers. It became known as Frazierville. There was a Gideon Frazier, a Stephen Frazier, a Reuben Frazier, a Henry Frazier, and all their wives who were named Frazier also. Can you imagine? What's the odds of that? That so many Fraziers in that little area came, and they were all unrelated. Soon, the railroad magnate by the name of William Palmer platted a town named LeBran, which means the bear. Back to the bear stories. It was just south and east of Frazierville. It never succeeded thanks to the loyalty of the residents shown to James McCandless, who had come on the scene, who was just establishing the town of Florence, not Frazierville. And this is proof that he did get possession of the land he was squatting on. The man's name who had been given this ground during the Civil War as a reward for having fought. His name was Miles Askew. Next picture. And this, I'm sorry you guys, is as close as I came to the abstract. But it says that this did not belong to Miles Askew, and this is the proof of his deed. And then the next picture is more proof that he did get it put in his name from the Askew guy. In 1860, Jesse had set out 20 fruit trees. They flourished. He was so amazed. He made a lot of money. The next year, he returned to Missouri to purchase more fruit trees. The business he purchased them from is still in operation today, by the way. It is called the Stark Brothers. They have a catalog. You can get it if you would like. He was soon developing the Colorado orange apple, which won first prize at all the judgings. Soon he was raising apples, pears, peaches, grapes, cherries, strawberries, blackberries, and raspberries. Most of the years, they had to prop up the limbs to support the weight of the crop. It was said that a foot branch yielded 50 well-formed apples at a time. In 1889, his orchard produced, if you have a calculator, you will see what this produced. His orchard produced 12,000 bushels of apples, selling at $3.50 a bushel. It was a pretty good paycheck. Imagine how beautiful the orchard was when it was in bloom. And then just imagine this, the smell. It had to be like being in heaven. Other crops raised by him and his neighbors are, get ready for this, potatoes, corn, oats, wheat, cabbage, turnips, onions, celery, watermelon. They raised alfalfa, straw, and whatever hen fruit is. I suppose it's eggs? I don't know. Anyway, it is reported that each of his tree would produce 100 bushels of apples, measuring 8 to 9 inches in circumference. Imagine. That barren ground that explorer named Long said could grow nothing was now producing lettuce, spinach, tomatoes that weighed half a pound each, carrots, parsnips, 30 or 40 varieties of apples, 3 kinds of plums, a quince, and, next picture, they said that this crop was very above average as well. Jesse was well loved by all who knew him. He was the first to invite neighbors into his home for church services. He donated land to build a church on, and you can see by this photo, this was the first blueprint for the Methodist Church in Florence. Soon, there was a Frazier Street used by the coal miners from Coal Creek and Rockville, those prosperous mining towns in that day, as well as today. Held in the highest regard by everyone he knew, he died on Thursday, May 9th, 1895, at 76 years, 27 days of age. He was a man of many firsts. He was the first to plow a field in Florence. He was the first to sell his produce. He was the first to plant an orchard, the first to file a mining claim, first to mine it for coal, first to sell his coal, the first to have Christian preaching in his home, the first to build a church, and he was the first county commissioner. His wife was the first white woman in Fremont County. Over the years, that farm has raised sugar beets, strawberries, and goats. It is now in the hands of my chicken cousin, Billy. I thank you for listening. And now, I told you he had to have irrigation water. And the family ties that go with this story, Rita will tell you about. So, welcome Rita Brenner. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Please give me a hand signal if I am not visible. And there goes my pointer, so don't worry about it. It's okay, I knocked the water. That's the more important part. Water is valuable. More valuable than gold. As a new arrival in the Western Plains from the Pacific Northwest, I can empathize with the arrivals that came here in the late 1860s. I believed water wasn't going to be a concern at all in my decision of moving here. During my childhood in Washington State, the Corps of Engineers were building canals and reservoirs to control spring and winter flooding and for erosion prevention. The side product was irrigation. The dams on the Snake River and the Columbia River, they were built for electricity. And again, irrigation was just the side product. To date, we have 333 ditches, 82 reservoirs, 213 wells here in Fremont County on the Arkansas and its contributaries. I listed these off by date of establishment because sometimes we just don't remember which cities came first. So, the town of Coal Creek their numbers are now included in Penrose. So, with those numbers in mind, it should come as no surprise that at the Kansas line, the Arkansas River is no more than 2 feet wide. It was in May this year. It does not recover its normal flow that we're used to in Florence until 72 miles at Garden City, Kansas. Our pioneers, coming from a greener state, and especially after crossing the prairie, their first concerns were about water. The Arkansas Valley Claim Club, also known as the Canyon City Claim Club, was established in 1860 by pioneers like Jesse Frazier, Lewis Conley, and the Belton brothers. This is Jesse's claim from the sheets of the Claim Club. Back then, the claims were limited to 160 acres, and they discovered that the western terrain could not support cattle on that little land. So in the 1880s, the limits were doubled for the claims. So we were now at 360 acres. The Claim Club not only recorded land claims, it spelled out water rights, and it acted as the mediator for disputes over water or land. We were part of the Kansas Territory, but officials on the eastern border of Kansas weren't too interested in writing a week-long trip across the prairie to assist us here in Canyon and Fremont to solve our disputes. Colorado's first legislative view on water rights was first in time, first in use. That originated with the California miners of 1848. The first miner to divert water from the stream for the purpose of mining gold was the first that had rights to that stream. Then the second miner, and the third, and etc. The miners brought this system with them when they came to our gold rush in 1858. There were more deaths among the miners over water rights than gold dust. Colorado's practice of first in time, first in use has caused itself a lot of trouble in its past. Just think about the dates of statehood. We're the bicentennial state, 1876. Kansas and California were first settled. Second, they were the first to enter the Union, and they were first to use the rivers whose headwaters were here in Colorado. Just an example and reminder, I just found out where the headwaters of the Arkansas were. So, Kansas has filed lawsuits against us since 1902 in a Supreme Court decision regarding the Arkansas River aquafill. We were ordered to pay Kansas $34 million for the loss of the water use and $1 million towards their court costs. Politicians today know that Colorado is faced with 19th century laws based to deal with 21st century water needs. Our first ditch was recorded in the Arkansas River Valley Claim Book is on the hardscrabble. The 1st of May, 1861. It was built to irrigate Henry Boland's 75 acres. In just 30 years, there were 34 ditches on the hardscrabble. This page is the Boland's land claims, and if you remember, I said they were brothers. I want you to look at on the left margin, off to the side, it says a transfer between son and father. This is why we like to get our hands on the originals. There's things we can catch, Transcribers do their best, but we all make mistakes. Next one. In 1862, the Claim Company disbanded and relinquished their ledgers to the newly established county. They were accepted as binding and legal and became part of the decree. The next ditch in the books is the Conley ditch, built on the Beaver Creek by John C. Palmer, not to be confused with the railroad investor, General William Palmer. It was to irrigate his 45 acres. Lewis Conley, a founding member of the Claim Company, had already established a grist mill on the Beaver Creek in 1860. This ditch gave John the second rights to the water of the Beaver Creek. The Conley grist mill was the first in Fremont County. His other accomplishments were the first postmaster of the town of Beaver Creek. He also served on a surveying team with Annis Rudd and J.P. Cooper, setting the boundaries for the county. Interestingly enough, their original drawings included parts of Custer County. J.P. Cooper was partners on the first sawmill with A.C. Chandler, Messrs. Moore and Harkins. The sawmill was located at the mouth of the Sandy Creek and held the first water rights of that creek. The third ditch built on the Beaver Creek was for the irrigation of the Tooth. Remember, it's like Tooth. Along with his brother George's acreage. By 1861, there were 7 ditches on the Beaver Creek, and the Tooth family also had one at the Arkansas River, the first one. Mary Tooth and her 5 sons farmed along the Beaver Creek and the Arkansas River as early as 1860. The Tooths, along with the Woodruff family, established the first school, or one of them, and they built a bridge across the Beaver Creek so the kids could get there. While school teachers were normally single women, one of the Tooth wives had to leave the classroom until this new school mom could be found. In 30 years, there were 37 ditches on the Beaver Creek, making it the busiest waterway in the county at that time. The towns of Beaver Creek and Glendale have since faded from our maps. Next page, please. Okay, this one's going to be hard. This is why I have the pointer, so please bear with me. We have above the first arrow here on the left, that is a motion being recorded that they were agreeing on the fees for the recorder to charge for each claim. It was $1 per claim. There are 35 members appearing on this. It might just be a roll call for that particular meeting. We haven't proved yet. So we have, the first arrow is P.H. Bolden, then it is Oscar Murphy, Eli Bolden, the father, and Jesse Frazier. And then we have Harold Youngblood, pardon me. On the other side, another name that you probably should recognize now that Dorothy spoke, and that is William Ashe. There's Robert Hall, and a J.J. Jenkins. They list that they had a one-woman member, but her name has been lost or forgotten, and since we only at this time have 8 pages of the Claim Club's ledgers, we'll have to prove that in another time. But we do know that the first claim recorded for a woman was the 4th ditch, built in 1861. It was named for the owner, Elizabeth Green. It was used to irrigate her 38 acres and the 7 acres of her husband's. It was also the first on the 4 Mile Creek, sometimes called the Oil Creek. Elizabeth and George are buried in the Greenwood Cemetery southwest of Kansas City. The Peggy Creek, number 8 on the books, was owned by Mrs. Margaret Baldridge, and it was on the Beaver Creek. Peggy Baldwin ran cattle, and she had her own brand. This is really a rare thing in 1861 for a woman to have a brand, probably not just for Colorado, but for the Kansas Territory. The most recognized ditch of 61 and the second to be built on the Arkansas is the Union Ditch Company's, recorded in November, and it was the last ditch of the year. It still serves Florence today. By 62, there were 3 ditches added, and the most known is the Fremont Ditch Company's on the Arkansas River. In 63, the Canyon City Hydraulic and Irrigation Ditch was added to the Arkansas. By the time Colonel William H. May, built his ditch on the Oak Creek of May of 1867, we were up to 37 ditches in the county. Some local historians give the impression that Colonel May was a quiet farmer and was surprised to find the coal on his property. Next one. Okay. Carol McNew, one of the researchers for this book, The Rockwell Nuggets, points out that Colonel May had a working understanding of geology and is more likely was just waiting for an opportune time to start mining his coal, which he did in 1880, partnering with Benjamin Rockwell, creating the Canyon City Coal Company. Fortunately for Rockville, and thanks to a May family mill back home in Vermont, Colonel May had a great understanding of the flow and the renewal of springs and creeks. Next. Thank you. This picture is one of the 5 wells along the Oak Creek. They are said to have the sweetest tasting water in the area. Due to the knowledge of pioneers like Colonel May, who recognized the natural formation of limestone caverns collecting water and the purifying properties of limestone, the cavern was capped off for the Rockville drinking water and later added value to the Florence water system. When the federal government denied giving both towns a grant for the water purification system, Rockville's water is now piped down to the Florence plant, and then returned for them. By 1891, 26 ditches were on the Oak Creek, and the county now totaled 90 ditches. This is the Minnequa Canal. It is probably taken near the Pathfinder Park. The Minnequa is owned primarily by the Rocky Mountain Steel, and it flows into the St. Lawrence Reserve. Standing to your left is George B. Buckley. He's a renowned assayer and photographer, and we don't know who the gentleman with him is. Next. Okay. The next step for Fremont County was to retain a good quality supply of water, was to construct reservoirs and dams. In 1898, the citizens of Florence gathered on Sundays with their plows and their teams of horses, and the ladies with their lunch boxes, and they dug themselves a great reservoir. Next. On the Beaver Creek in 1907, the Schaefer Dam, an earth-filled structure, was completed and served as a great water source for the now Penrose area. Once a great garden and a fruit tree paradise. In the flood of 1921, this dam played a major part in the damage that occurred. when it failed under the stress of 3 days of rainfall. When the dam finally gave way, it took just 30 minutes to drain completely. The Arkansas River got backed up into Florence, and at the Swallows, 19 miles downstream, the blunt of the force took out several buildings and all the freight cars on the side track. With the force of the Beaver and now an additional 3 creeks, the Arkansas River made its final entry, a grand one, into Pueblo at 2:15 p.m. on June 5th, 1921. We have just marked the 100-year anniversary of that catastrophe. Next. This is Beaver Creek in 21. Next. And these next 3 slides are going to be of Florence. They probably don't look that much different, than what happened to us in 21, except for maybe the model of cars and a tiny bit of fashion change in the men's clothing. Okay, next. In Custer County on the Great Creek, construction began on another dam for the benefit of Fremont County and, more precisely, Lincoln Park. Upon completion in 1904, this dam reached the height of 51 feet and a base of 75 feet in width. I have to warn you at this point, you know this dam as the Deweese Dye Reservoir. Well, I'm going to end up calling it and referring to it as the Dye Deweese. And I'd like to tell you the reason is because I always think that the financer of a project should get first billing. But the truth is, whenever anybody here in my new home finds out my maiden name is Dye, their first question is, are you related to the Dye of Dye Deweese ditch? I finally went and revisited our Royal Gorge Museum and found a plaque near the Deweese fireplace. It states the home of Del Deweese was Troy, Miami County, Ohio. That night, with all my genealogy files around me, this was my discovery. Okay. I hope you can tell that's still me. My 5th great grandfather, Stephen, is Charles' grandfather's son. My grandfather is the 2nd child. His father is the 10th of 11 children. They are 21 years difference in age. I am proud to tell you Dye Deweese, along with his friend and partner, Charles Robert C. Dye, proved to be great assets for this county. They found and delivered a permanent irrigation system for their private properties and their dream, the Fruitland development property in Lincoln Park. Del was a farmer's son with a success in horticulture. He saw in Canyon City the potential for rapid growth and great gardens and orchards. With the financial backing from the William H. Dye and Son Bank of Troy, Ohio, and the business savvy of the 3, they formed the Deweese Dye Reservoir Company. Okay. Del's home was turned into a bed and breakfast, and unfortunately it burned in 2007. Charles's house is on 9th and Grand Avenue in Canyon, and just to reinforce how small our world is, I have driven by this house and loved it for the last 5 years, since I bought a house just 2 blocks away from it, and I never knew. She found it for me. So, they started purchasing lands for their orchards and for their development, and they acquired 1,100 acres, 10 acres at a time. They extended the Crooked Creek by 1886, and to build the planned ditch that they wanted to run through their development, they acquired the water rights of the Great Creek and constructed their namesake ditch, only to discover they needed a more reliable water source. Next one, please. Okay. We're not completely convinced who built this stone reservoir off New York Avenue, and it's right at the new trailhead of the Beaver Creek. But we do know that it was replaced by the Dyke East Dam, and that at this point all the ditches go underground. Next. Okay. Yes, just one more. Okay. This ice house was built in 1890. It's one of two facilities on this creek. Next. Making use of winter temperatures to make and to be a source for the cut ice blocks that we needed for food storage. Next. Oh, no, my fault. Dill knew the wet mountains could be a reliable source, and he proved it. In the addition of the dam in Custer County and the lake behind it, the one sip of water. The Dye-DeWeese Company maintains 3 small reservoirs and 12.5 miles of ditch in the Lincoln Park. Next slide now. Thank you. I would like to introduce you to the next voice from within our archive. This gentleman had a heart of a warrior and the soul of a true steward of the land. Next. I met Lynn Belton posthumously through his wife reading the Yellow Cake Road and his files in the archive, and by talking to his daughter. Next. Nope, should be the book. Okay. Lynn was a child of the Dust Bowl. The work ethic and the drive of those children is an accurate portrayal of Lynn. He developed a strong interest in chemistry while in high school and spent most of his professional life as a chemist. Following World War II and the deployment of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, America was undeniably in a new industrial revolution and new business ventures centered on atomic use and development. In 1956, the Cotter Corporation built a uranium mill in Fremont County. They were hyped as a developer of a peacetime use for nuclear material. Lynn was offered a position at that time as assistant chief chemist, and this was in '58. A new venture in a new industry, a new home on 3 acres in Lincoln Park. The Bowdens celebrated their good fortune, as did the city of Canyon. But there are downsides to new industries, and radioactive material has many. There is waste disposal, safe transportation of both the product and the byproduct, the control and safety of the facility and for the workers, and public safety. The city of Canyon was about to discover the downsides of having uranium here. One day after work, the usually healthy Lynn came home seriously ill. It followed a day in which he had walked into the laboratory and found his staff, including high school interns, roughhousing and spraying each other with lab squirt bottles. If pure water, those were toys. And that's okay. But if corrosive material, that makes a toy into a weapon. Soon afterwards, Lynn spoke to management about the family well being contaminated. The CEO asked him to quietly test the other employees' wells. With the secrecy included in that request, Lynn grew concerned for the safety of his fellow employees his family, and his community. In Fremont County, wells are for domestic use only. The property owner can buy the rights to use the water for irrigation. This, of course, is naturally, this increases property values and marketability. For the next few years, Lynn experienced serious bouts of an illness misdiagnosed as a bleeding ulcer. The ulcer was never found, but he continued to require frequent blood transfusions. A very sick man, feeling that Cotter had betrayed the community, and he no longer had a choice but to take action to protect the things that he loved. Neighbors' cows had intestinal problems. Calves were being aborted, or they were being born disformed. The fruit blossoms were wilting on the trees. Crops and grasses were contaminated. The health department banned Lincoln Park growers from selling their products, but they never banned the private consumption of those same products. Every home in Lincoln Park suffered and felt the results of using well water for drinking and bathing, or the indirect exposure of this poison through irrigation. Next slide. Luckily, most of the contamination was in the wells. But how and when does irrigation water return to the river or into the aquifer, or does it evaporate into the air? The Colorado Bureau of Investigation was now on the scene in 1979. The agent insisted on interviewing Lynn outside in the open, explaining that his opinion was that the house had been bugged, either by Cotter or one who had a vested interest in deniability. Under the advice of his attorney, Lynn told the truth, all of it. 2 slides. In 1984, the Cotter Mill and Lincoln Park earned the EPA designation of a Superfund site. Interestingly, the Cotter name was not in any of the formal titles. City officials and local power brokers were either naive or they acted like an EPA designation was a gold medal. There's no category in the Olympics for contamination. As the cleanup began at the Cotter site along the railroad tracks, and local realtors were now being asked the hard questions, the reality finally hit home. Okay, without knocking something off this table, the shaded areas are the contaminated sections. The flow of the water, due to grade, was going to the northeast, straight to the river. The Dyed-East ditch and their 3 small reservoirs are just where we start seeing the blocks. Right in there. Okay. So, Lynn respected his fellow workers, and he enjoyed knowing his boss. Dion's garden center customers were a source of delight to her, and yet there was a change in attitude being directed at them. After years of community involvement and dedication, they felt hurt and shocked at the actions of some of the people in their community. The house was being vandalized. The phone calls were now needing to be screened. The boys were sent away to live at a private school, and luckily, daughter Jerry was ready to go away to college. All this time, Lynn was getting sicker and weaker. He was puzzled over this sudden vengeful attack. He was fighting for their rights and their well-being. Didn't they understand this? In the spring of 2002, Lynn died of cancer, a cancer that occurs 400 times the norm among workers around uranium. The family chose not to lay him to rest in the community that had just shunned him. So they scattered his ashes near the Lake Deweese. Lynn and Dion had served on the Deweese Ditch Executive Board for several years. So what better place to rest a man who loved and served Lincoln Park? I don't want to leave you today on such a sad note, so please just let me tell you one more story from this voice of the archive. The town of Silver Cliff has no stream, no river, and they survive by the water of their wells. During a very dry year, they were nearly out of water. Our practice of first in time, first in years, had given Kansas power over the aquifer that those wells were being drawn from. Lynn talked them into buying shares of the Deweese Reservoir, and not just any share. He cleverly worded their water rights deeds, naming 1 acre on the bottom of the lake so they never would lose all their water to Kansas again in a dry year. The next time you visit Lake Deweese, please sit at Lynn's bench, look towards the Santa Cruz Mountains, and remember his advice. Never hate or disrespect the person, but still fight the fight. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for our presenters today? Melvin?
I'm knee-deep in ditch water, so I really enjoyed your presentation about ditch water, but I guess the biggest question I have is why today ditch water is not used so much when it used to be the lifeblood of the community. That's kind of a generic question, I think I know the answer because you could go to the store and buy bottled water and you don't need that. You can get vegetables from Mexico. In the early days you couldn't go get vegetables at your grocery store. You had to go over yourself. So I think if you look back in those days, you probably did pay a lot more attention to water than you do now. But we all need water. So I think all the presentations were wonderful also. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I'd like to thank you all for attending. We really appreciate you being here. Thank you to the Bell Tower for letting us use their facility. It's wonderful. We'd like to thank Scott for having done the sound for us. He's done a great job. I'd also like to thank Carol McNew for getting our PowerPoint ready and going, and for Marty LaCouse, who is our project chairwoman this year. She's done a great job of keeping us on track. And to Rita Brenner and Dorothy Kuhl and Lynn Belton for today's presentations. We really appreciate their dedication and work and the research that they have done. The Florence and the people from the Royal Gorge who are recording this for us, I apologize for overlooking that. The Florence Historical Archive is a 501c3, a nonprofit organization that was started in 2016. The archive is a repository of documents considered extremely important for future generations of historical researchers. The stories of people, places, events are told in the documents, newspapers, pictures, diaries of those who were here when it was wild and untamed. Included in this information are stories about miners, homesteaders, ranchers, fruit growers, and industry workers of the Fremont County. Our original collection was compiled by John and Carol Fox starting back in 1960. Their collection was anything on paper that was related to the history of the area. Their collection boasts some original items, but for the most part consists of copies. The value of the collection is not in the original material, but in the scope of the history it covers in the decades of thorough research of early settlers, events, industries, and locations. Through Carol Fox's collection, although Carol Fox's collection was the basis for the archive, it is now made up of several collections, such as Bob Wood's collection of the Florence citizens starting in 1940, the Florence Chamber of Commerce, the Rialto, and recently we got the Stones and Bones collection. If you would like to add your voice to the archive, you could do so by donating to the archive. We accept donations of individual pieces and complete collections. So if you have photos, diaries, newspaper articles, or maps representing the local history that you would like to donate, we would be delighted to accept them. Each year, we choose a topic for research and presentation and our volunteers have a great time doing the research and speaking at the presentations. All of our dedicated workers at the archive are volunteers. Anyone who would like to become part of our organization and work with this exciting historical information, we would encourage you to volunteer. Our facility is located at the Florence City building, around by the police entrance. Our next presentation will be on September 12th, when we will be presenting the reminiscence and legacy of Edwin Beale Loback and the early land claims from 1862 and forward. Now, please join us for some refreshments, and thank you so much for attending.